Introduction. The crisis of certain tithe human mind is a magnificent, self-correcting machine except when it comes to admitting it's wrong. In an era defined by a constant, overwhelming flood of information, the ability to process, assess, and most crucially, reevaluate our convictions has become the ultimate determinant of personal and societal progress. Yet we are witness to a paradox as access to facts has soared. The willingness to change one's mind has plummeted. We live in a world carved into tribes, political, ideological, spiritual, and even aesthetic. These tribes are bound not just by shared values but by a collective, deeply held set of beliefs that act as non-negotiable foundations for identity. To challenge a foundational belief is not just an intellectual disagreement. It is an act of treason against the self and the group. This tribal structure keeps individuals locked in fixed worldviews, creating a rigid, polarized landscape where genuine intellectual exchange withers and dies. The core of this rigidity lies in a powerful, often debilitating psychological process, cognitive dissonance, defining the core problem, the refusal to shangeth psychological process required to admit one is wrong. Change one's mind and overcome this crippling tribalism is nothing less than the conscious, deliberate management of cognitive dissonance. This is a difficult, painful, and deeply uncomfortable experience, which is precisely why it is so often avoided. Admitting an error threatens the core human need for psychological consonance, the state where our thoughts, beliefs, and actions are consistent with one another. To find out a deeply held belief is false, or that a significant action was based on a flawed premise, creates a jarring, mental-emotional clash, the state of dissonance. This tension is so profoundly uncomfortable that the mind employs a sophisticated, often invisible self-defense system designed to immediately eliminate it. The simplest path to relief is almost never to change the belief. It is to justify, rationalize, or deny the contradictory evidence. The evidence becomes the enemy, not the error, introducing the solution. Cognitive dissonance as the engine of evolution. This article argues that the capacity for intellectual growth is directly proportional to one's willingness to endure and leverage the pain of cognitive dissonance. The process of personal and intellectual evolution is not a smooth, continuous glide. It is a series of jarring, uncomfortable leaps fueled by the mental friction of two contradictory ideas wrestling for dominance, cognitive dissonance. First articulated by Leon Festinger in 1957, is not merely a phenomenon of discomfort. It is the engine of intellectual evolution. It is the alarm bell that signals a discrepancy between the map, our worldview, and the territory, reality. Our default, survival-driven response is to silence the alarm and cling to the old map. The path to intellectual humility, the ultimate antidote to fixed worldviews, requires us to listen to the alarm, trust the friction, and commit to redrawing the map, the thesis, the architecture of intellectual humility. The goal of this exhaustive exploration is to deconstruct the psychological process involved in intellectual self-correction. We will not only analyze the mechanisms of denial, the why, but also provide a deep, actionable framework for conversion, the how. Our central thesis is this: intellectual humility is not the absence of belief, but the conscious, heroic willingness to endure cognitive dissonance for the sake of truth, growth, and adaptability. By understanding the inner workings of dissonance theory and its interaction with social tribalism, we can design a personal architecture that makes admitting error a pathway to strength, rather than an admission of weakness. The journey begins by dissecting the core mechanism itself, the inescapable motivating power of cognitive dissonance. Introduction. The crisis of certain tithe human mind is a magnificent, self-correcting machine except when it comes to admitting it's wrong. In an era defined by a constant, overwhelming flood of information, the ability to process, assess, and most crucially, reevaluate our convictions has become the ultimate determinant of personal and societal progress. Yet we are witness to a paradox as access to facts has soared. The willingness to change one's mind has plummeted. We live in a world carved into tribes, political, ideological, spiritual, and even aesthetic. These tribes are bound not just by shared values but by a collective, deeply held set of beliefs that act as non-negotiable foundations for identity. To challenge a foundational belief is not just an intellectual disagreement. It is an act of treason against the self and the group. This tribal structure keeps individuals locked in fixed worldviews, creating a rigid, Polarized landscape where genuine intellectual exchange withers and dies. The core of this rigidity lies in a powerful, often debilitating psychological process, cognitive dissonance, defining the core problem, the refusal to shangeth psychological process required to admit one is wrong. Change one's mind and overcome this crippling tribalism is nothing less than the conscious, deliberate management of cognitive dissonance. This is a difficult, painful, and deeply uncomfortable experience, which is precisely why it is so often avoided. Admitting an error threatens the core human need for psychological consonance, the state where our thoughts, beliefs, and actions are consistent with one another. To find out a deeply held belief is false, or that a significant action was based on a flawed premise, creates a jarring, mental emotional clash, the state of dissonance. This tension is so profoundly uncomfortable that the mind employs a sophisticated, often invisible self-defense system designed to immediately eliminate it. The simplest path to relief is almost never to change the belief. It is to justify, rationalize, or deny the contradictory evidence. The evidence becomes the enemy, not the error, introducing the solution. Cognitive dissonance as the engine of evolution. This article argues that the capacity for intellectual growth is directly proportional to one's willingness to endure and leverage the pain of cognitive dissonance. The process of personal and intellectual evolution is not a smooth, continuous glide. It is a series of jarring, uncomfortable leaps fueled by the mental friction of two contradictory ideas wrestling for dominance, cognitive dissonance. First articulated by Leon Festinger in 1957, is not merely a phenomenon of discomfort. It is the engine of intellectual evolution. It is the alarm bell that signals a discrepancy between the map, our worldview, and the territory reality. Our default, survival-driven response is to silence the alarm and cling to the old map. The path to intellectual humility, the ultimate antidote to fixed worldviews, requires us to listen to the alarm, trust the friction, and commit to redrawing the map, the thesis, the architecture of intellectual humility. The goal of this exhaustive exploration is to deconstruct the psychological process involved in intellectual self-correction. We will not only analyze the mechanisms of denial, the why, but also provide a deep, actionable framework for conversion, the how. Our central thesis is this: intellectual humility is not the absence of belief, but the conscious, heroic willingness to endure cognitive dissonance for the sake of truth, growth, and adaptability. By understanding the inner workings of dissonance theory and its interaction with social tribalism, we can design a personal architecture that makes admitting error a pathway to strength, rather than an admission of weakness. The journey begins by dissecting the core mechanism itself, the inescapable motivating power of cognitive dissonance. 2. Section 1. The core mechanism. Cognitive Dissonance Theory (CDT). The journey to intellectual humility begins not with a choice, but with a clash. This clash is the foundation of the field's most influential and durable social psychological theory, Cognitive Dissonance Theory (CDT). Understanding CDT is not merely academic. It is to possess the blueprint of the mind's automatic self-correction and self-deception systems, the foundation. Leon Festinger's original theory, 1957. Cognitive dissonance theory was introduced by psychologist Leon Festinger in his landmark 1957 book, A Theory of Cognitive Dissonance. Festinger's core observation was elegantly simple: humans possess a fundamental, powerful drive for internal consistency. We crave a neat, logical, and harmonious relationship between our beliefs, our values, and our actions, a cognition. In this context is any piece of knowledge, opinion, or belief about the self, the environment, or one's behavior. Dissonance arises when an individual simultaneously holds two or more cognitions that are psychologically inconsistent with one another. For example, cognition A, belief, I am an intelligent, honest person; cognition B, behavior or evidence, I just lied to my business partner about the company's financials. These two cognitions are dissonant because they don't fit together. The dissonance is not logical or philosophical inconsistency. It is psychological discomfort. It's the mental equivalent of two magnets repelling one another, a tension so aversive that the mind is immediately motivated to reduce or eliminate it, the inevitable tension. Defining dissonance and consonance. Dissonance is a motivational state akin to hunger or thirst that compels the individual to act. The magnitude of the dissonance experienced is a function of two variables: importance. How important are the cognitions involved? Dissonance regarding a minor preference, for example, I believe this soda is the best vs I bought a different, cheaper soda is trivial. Dissonance regarding a core identity pillar, for example, I believe in free speech vs I just advocated for censoring a political opponent, is monumental. The more central the belief is to one's self-concept, the higher the resulting dissonance ratio. What is the ratio of dissonant to consonant cognitions? If a person holds 10 cognitions supporting a belief and one piece of evidence against it, the dissonance is lower than if they hold 5 cognitions, 4 and 5 against consonants. Conversely is the state of agreement, comfort, and internal alignment. All psychological energy is directed toward achieving or maintaining this state. 3 modes of dissonance reduction when dissonance arises. The mind has a limited, 3-pronged arsenal to achieve quick relief and restore consonance. The individual will instinctively choose the path of least resistance, the one that requires the least intellectual, emotional, or social cost. 1. Changing behavior, the hardest path. The most honest way to resolve dissonance is to change the behavior to align with the belief. Dissonance: I believe smoking is deadly and I smoke 2 packs a day. Resolution: quit smoking. Cost: high. This requires willpower, overcoming addiction, and significant behavioral change. This is the path of true self-correction, but often the least selected because of the effort and discomfort involved. 2. Changing cognition or belief, the core of mind changing. This involves altering one of the conflicting beliefs to fit the other. Dissonance: I believe my political leader is honest and my leader was just caught in a lie. Resolution: change the belief about the leader. My leader is not honest. I was wrong to support them. Cost: high. This requires admitting error, risking social ostracization from the tribe, and restructuring a portion of one's worldview. This is the essence of admitting you are wrong. And it is the necessary psychological process to break fixed worldviews. 3. Adding new consonant cognitions, the path of self-justification. This is the default, most common, and most dangerous mechanism. Instead of changing the original belief or behavior, the mind invents new justifications to rationalize the inconsistency, thus lowering the perceived magnitude of the dissonance. Dissonance: same as above, I believe my leader is honest and my leader was just caught in a lie. Resolution: add justifying cognitions. The lie was necessary to protect the country, or the news media is biased and twisted the context, or all politicians lie. So this one lie doesn't matter. Cost: low. The behavior or belief is preserved. The ego is protected and the dissonance is reduced. But the individual moves further away from reality. This is the foundation of rationalization and a key driver of tribal rigidity. Case study: the classic experiment, the boring task study. One of the most powerful demonstrations of this third mechanism is Festinger and Carl Smith's 1959 experiment. Often called the boring task study, participants were asked to perform an extremely monotonous, repetitive task like turning pegs for an hour. Afterward, they were asked to lie to the next participant, telling them the task was actually fun and interesting. Group A was paid $1, a very small sum at the time. To lie, Group B was paid $20, a substantial sum. To lie, a control group was not asked to lie. Later, all participants were asked how much they actually enjoyed the boring task. The results were astounding. Group B, $20 to lie, reported the task was boring. They had low dissonance. The cognition I lied was easily justified by the consonant cognition I was paid $20 to do it. The money served as sufficient external justification. Group A, $1 to lie, reported the task was significantly more enjoyable than the $20 group. They had high dissonance. The cognition I lied could not be justified by the paltry $1 payment. To reduce the uncomfortable dissonance, their minds performed a phenomenal trick. They changed the original belief. They convinced themselves, I didn't actually lie because the task was genuinely fun. The $1 group had to change their internal reality because their external justification was insufficient. This profound finding proves that when we lack external justification for an inconsistent action, the mind is compelled to seek internal justification, often by altering the very beliefs we hold true. This is the psychological lever we must pull to overcome fixed worldviews. Section 2. The self-defense protocols. Why we resist change. If cognitive dissonance is the engine driving the need for consistency, then a host of specialized cognitive biases are the operating system the mind runs to satisfy that need with the least possible change. These mechanisms are so pervasive and automatic that they often sabotage any earnest attempt at self-correction before it even begins. The decision to not change your mind is rarely a conscious, rational choice. It is usually the result of a coordinated, low-level psychological defense activated the moment contradictory information is encountered. 1. Confirmation bias, the active search for consonances most well-known and perhaps most debilitating of these self-defense protocols is confirmation bias. This is the tendency to actively seek out, interpret, favor, and recall information that confirms or supports one's prior beliefs or values when a belief is challenged. For example, an individual who supports a specific economic policy receives data showing its failure. The mind does not engage in neutral analysis. Instead, it immediately launches a search and seizure mission, selective exposure. The individual will gravitate toward news sources, experts, and social circles that already agree with the policy. Thus shielding themselves from dissonant data, selective interpretation, they will critically scrutinize, find flaws in, and discount the methodology of the data that suggests failure. Simultaneously, they will uncritically accept any counter-evidence, no matter how weak, that suggests the policy is actually successful. Selective recall, they will more readily remember past instances or anecdotes where similar policies appeared to work, while conveniently forgetting their failures. Confirmation bias is the mind's way of ensuring the balance of cognitions always favors the established belief consonants by actively filtering out the dissonant information before it can even be processed as a genuine threat. It is the psychological gatekeeper of the fixed worldview. 2. The backfire effect, strengthening belief under attack. While confirmation bias involves ignoring contradictory evidence, the backfire effect is a far more aggressive psychological defense. It describes the phenomenon where, when core beliefs are challenged by evidence, people reject the evidence and strengthen their original beliefs. The backfire effect is often triggered when the challenge to a belief is perceived as a personal, high-stakes threat. The dissonant evidence does not lead to self-correction. It leads to self-entrenchment. The mechanism, a belief, especially a tribal or political one, is not just a cognition. It is a social flag and a core component of personal identity. When presented with undeniable evidence that the belief is wrong, the threat is existential. If the belief is false, then I am fundamentally mistaken, and my social standing is compromised. The reaction, to reduce this profound dissonance and protect the self-concept, the mind doesn't argue with the data. It argues with the source. The evidence is rejected as malicious, biased, or part of a conspiracy, and the original, familiar belief is overcompensated for by being held even more tightly. The backfire effect transforms a potential moment of intellectual growth into a cycle of heightened ideological rigidity. It shows that in the high-stakes game of identity, the self-preservation instinct overpowers the truth-seeking instinct. 3. Belief preservation, the need for a coherent self-narrative beyond specific biases. The mind has a generalized, powerful need for predictability and narrative coherence. A fixed worldview, no matter how flawed, is a psychologically safe place because it provides a predictable narrative for understanding complex reality, changing. A deeply entrenched belief is not like swapping out a single brick. It's like dismantling a load-bearing wall. Domino effect. If a central belief is admitted to be wrong, it forces a chain reaction, requiring the individual to reevaluate dozens of related beliefs and past decisions that were built upon that faulty premise. For example, admitting one's political party is flawed might force a person to reevaluate every vote, every argument, and every social relationship they've built over a decade. The threat of chaos, this necessary intellectual restructuring, is perceived by the psyche as a descent into cognitive chaos. To avoid this sense of groundlessness, the mind fiercely resists the initial dissonant input, preferring the comfort of the existing, coherent if false narrative. For ego and identity, the self as the belief, the final and most potent layer of defense is the intimate connection between a belief and the ego. For many people, a belief is not something they hold. It is something they are. When a belief becomes a pillar of personal identity, for example, I am an environmental activist, I am a devoted conservative, I am a self-made entrepreneur. Admitting that belief is wrong translates in the subconscious to I, as a person, am wrong, flawed, incompetent. This transformation from an intellectual error to an identity crisis pushes the dissonance to maximum pain. The defense mechanism then shifts to a survival response, triggering aggressive rationalization mode 3 reduction. My opponents are simply too stupid to understand my belief. The data is a deliberate attack on my community values. My entire personal and social history confirms this belief. So the contradictory evidence must be an outlier. In summary, these self-defense protocols: confirmation bias, the backfire effect, the need for belief preservation, and the fusion of ego with belief work in concert to minimize the effort and maximize the psychological relief of dissonance reduction. They are the primary reasons why the average person confronted with solid evidence will choose to protect their worldview rather than correct it. This entrenched rigidity then becomes the very foundation of tribalism, which is the focus of our next section. The logical next step in our deep dive into intellectual humility is to examine the internal emotional landscape that makes admitting error so agonizing. Here is the expanded content for Section 4, The Psychology of Being Wrong, the Emotional Toll. V. Section 4, The Psychology of Being Wrong, the Emotional Toll. We have established that cognitive dissonance drives the need for consistency, and tribalism raises the social cost of changing a belief. Yet even when alone, facing only a mirror, the process of admitting error remains intensely painful. This pain stems from a sophisticated psychological architecture designed to protect the ego and the self-concept from damage. The truth is that admitting one is wrong is not a cognitive task. It is an emotional trauma the psyche fights to avoid. 1. Shame and vulnerability, the emotional defeat. Immediate psychological reaction to the realization that a deeply held belief is flawed is often one of profound shame. This shame is not just for the error itself, but for the flaw in the self that allowed the error to persist. Vulnerability of intellect. When a person publicly commits to a position, their intellectual competence becomes exposed. If the position collapses, the individual feels vulnerable to criticism, ridicule, or worst of all, pity. This vulnerability triggers a deep-seated defensive reflex, the loss of authority, for those who rely on their knowledge or conviction for professional or social standing. For example, an expert, a community leader, or an entrepreneur building a belief-based brand like the user's elemental soul. Admitting error equates to a dramatic loss of authority. The intellectual defeat is experienced as a social and personal demotion. Concealing the crack, the mind will therefore work relentlessly to conceal the crack in the worldview, minimizing the dissonant evidence to avoid the catastrophic emotional fallout of having to confront one's own fallibility. 2. Attribution theory and self-blamer. Reluctance to admit error is deeply rooted in how we explain the causes of events, a field of study known as attribution theory. Specifically, we employ self-serving biases to protect our ego when attributing success and failure, attributing success when we succeed. We tend to attribute the positive outcome to internal, stable factors: our intelligence, hard work, competence. I was right because I am smart, attributing failure or error. When we are wrong, admitting it means attributing the failure to the internal, stable factor of our own poor judgment or flawed intellect. I was wrong because I am incompetent, to avoid the identity-shattering cognition that one is fundamentally flawed. Cognition A. I am incompetent. The mind instinctively reverts to external, unstable attributions. Mode 3 Dissonance reduction. I wasn't wrong. The data was faulty. External. I wasn't wrong. I was misled by bad actors. External. I wasn't wrong. The timing was off. Unstable. The psychological goal is not to find the truth but to protect the core cognition. I am a fundamentally smart and capable person. Attributing error externally shields the ego from the self-blame inherent in admitting intellectual failure. 3. The sunk cost fallacy of belief. One of the most robust cognitive barriers to admitting error is the sunk cost fallacy. This fallacy, usually applied to economics, translates seamlessly to the realm of belief. Economic sunk cost, continuing to invest resources, time, Money in a project simply because of the resources already invested, belief sunk cost, continuing to defend a worldview simply because of the time, energy, emotional investment, and reputation already staked on it. A fixed worldview is not acquired cheaply. The investment includes time, years spent reading, researching, and debating to cement the belief, reputation, the social standing gained within the tribal fortress built upon the belief, emotional labor, the intensity of arguing, defending, and even fighting for the belief. If an individual admits the belief is wrong now, they must simultaneously accept that all those previous investments were wasted. This realization that one has spent years being wrong generates an enormous, acute burst of dissonance. To reduce this historical dissonance, the mind chooses the path of least cognitive resistance, double down on the investment. The logic becomes, I have invested too much to be wrong now. Therefore, the belief must be right, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The need to validate past self-investment becomes a greater psychological priority than factual accuracy, for the role of existential fear at the deepest level. The refusal to change a fixed worldview is driven by existential fear. A worldview, particularly one adopted via tribalism, serves as an intellectual safety net that provides answers to life's biggest, most frightening questions. The fixed worldview provides certainty, a clear map for navigating a complex, unpredictable world, meaning a defined purpose and narrative for one's life choices, moral clarity, a simple division of the world into good us and bad them. When a fixed belief is challenged, it threatens to collapse the entire framework, plunging the individual into fear of the unknown. If this is wrong, what else is wrong? Where does the truth actually lie? Existential uncertainty, the terror of having to reevaluate one's core decisions, life purpose, and moral compass. The pain of intellectual humility, the acceptance of radical uncertainty, and the ever-present possibility of being wrong is psychologically processed as a massive vulnerability. To survive this trauma, the mind quickly closes ranks, preferring the comforting, predictable lie of the fixed worldview over the terrifying, chaotic truth of self-correction. Overcoming this requires not just logic but a conscious act of emotional bravery, a willingness to face the psychological void, which is the focus of our forthcoming discussion on navigating the dissonant state. Section 5. The process of conversion. Navigating the dissonant state. Fixed worldview is held in place by powerful psychological gravity. To overcome it requires more than just evidence. It requires a structured, conscious process of navigating the intense discomfort of cognitive dissonance without immediately resorting to the mind's default self-justification protocols. The path to intellectual flexibility is a multi-step journey through this uncomfortable, often painful state. Step 1. The trigger event. The cognitive crack change is rarely gradual. It is typically initiated by a trigger event, a moment where the dissonant evidence becomes so undeniable, so emotionally salient, or so publicly humiliating that the mind's standard defense protocols, confirmation bias, backfire effect, temporarily fail. This is the cognitive crack in the fortress wall. The trigger is often characterized by a combination of high stakes and personal relevance. Undeniable personal experience. The failure of a cherished belief directly impacts the individual's life or business success, for example. A favored investment strategy fails repeatedly, or a trusted spiritual practice, like one related to Kamina Priya or elemental soul, produces contradictory results. Irrefutable authority. The dissonant information comes from a source the individual cannot logically reject without destroying another, more powerful consonant cognition. For example, a core mentor or respected scientist in their own field presents the contradictory evidence. The trigger event doesn't cause the change. It forces the individual into the dissonant state with such intensity that the easy route of self-justification is temporarily blocked. The mind is momentarily paralyzed between the old comfortable lie and the new challenging truth. Step 2. The moment of suspension. Enduring the tension. This is the most critical and difficult stage. The individual must learn to tolerate and sustain the intense, aversive tension of cognitive dissonance without acting to reduce it immediately. This is the practice of intellectual courage. The default action of the brain is to achieve consonance immediately. The goal of conversion is to teach the brain a new response, suspension of judgment, tolerating ambiguity. The individual consciously acknowledges the opposing cognitions and refuses to choose a side for a defined period. They must sit in the discomfort of knowing, my belief A is probably false, but I don't yet know what belief B to replace it with. This is the psychological equivalent of being adrift at sea, the power of maybe. Actively replacing the binary choice of right-wrong with the probabilistic, flexible term maybe. This linguistic shift dampens the ego's immediate defensive response by changing the goal from winning the argument to gathering more data, mindfulness of dissonance. Using mindfulness techniques to observe the physical and emotional manifestations of dissonance anxiety. Frustration, urge to justify without judgment. By observing the mechanism, the individual gains a fraction of control over its automated response. The ability to remain in this state of suspension is the single most defining characteristic of the intellectually flexible mind. Step 3. The search for a higher consonantience. The tension has been sustained. The mind's powerful drive for consonance can finally be leveraged for change rather than against it. Instead of seeking low-level consonance, for example, confirming the old belief, the individual initiates a search for a higher consonance, a new belief structure that is more integrated, more fact-based, and more protective of the individual's core values than the previous fixed worldview. This requires two deliberate psychological moves. Decoupling ego from belief. The individual must consciously separate their personal worth from the validity of the specific cognition, affirming self-worth. Utilizing self-affirmation theory to mitigate the ego threat. The individual reminds themselves, I may have been wrong about this specific economic policy, but I am still a kind, ethical, and intelligent person. By affirming their core identity competence. Morality in an unrelated domain, the necessity of defending the flawed cognition is reduced. The ego is protected, allowing the belief to be abandoned. Be finding the transcendent principle. Focus shifts from who is right to what is true. The individual asks, what fundamental, high-level value, for example, truth, compassion, adaptability, does this new contradictory evidence actually serve better than my old belief? The new belief B is embraced not because the evidence is overwhelming, but because it aligns with a deeper, more profound cognition. C, for example, the core value of rational truth-seeking that the individual deems more important than the old belief A. The mind finds a new, more stable consonance by aligning belief with a core ethical commitment. Step 4. Integrating the new cognition. The final step is the successful assimilation of the new, corrected belief. The journey is not complete until the new belief is rerouted into the individual's history and self-narrative, the narrative rewrite. The individual reconstructs their past actions not as a history of error, but as a history of learning and evolution. The old narrative, I was a fool who believed X for 10 years, is replaced with, I was a truth seeker who utilized the best data available at the time, and who possessed the intellectual courage to revise my conclusion when new, better data emerged. The growth mindset. This final integration affirms the self as an adaptable, learning entity. The memory of admitting error is encoded not with shame but with the pride of having successfully navigated the profound discomfort of cognitive dissonance to achieve a higher truth. This establishes a precedent, making the mind more flexible and receptive to future challenges, the very definition of intellectual humility. Section 6. Cultivating intellectual humility. The antidote. The process of enduring and leveraging cognitive dissonance is difficult, but it is a discrete event. To prevent the fixed worldview from hardening again, one must cultivate its psychological opposite, intellectual humility. This is not a passive trait but an active skill that must be rigorously practiced. Intellectual humility is the antidote to the rigid tribalism that plagues modern discourse. 1. Defining intellectual humility. Intellectual humility is often confused with low self-esteem or a lack of conviction. It is neither. It is the conscious, self-aware recognition of the limits of one's own knowledge and the acceptance that one's current beliefs may be wrong or incomplete. Is not being unsure of your facts, refusing to take a stand, or abandoning your values. Is the awareness that your current degree of conviction must be proportional to the quality and totality of the evidence available to you. It is the comfort with the proposition, based on the information I have right now, this is my conclusion. But I reserve the right and the duty to change it if new data emerges. By holding this metacognition, The ego is decoupled from the belief structure. When new evidence arrives, it is no longer perceived as a personal attack, but as a welcome data update. 2. The metacognition of doubt, a critical thinking tool. Intellectual humility hinges on changing the psychological valuation of doubt. In tribal, fixed worldviews, doubt is treason, a sign of weakness and disloyalty. In the flexible mind, doubt is a critical thinking tool and an indicator of high intelligence. Pre-doubt, the pre-mortem. A specific technique is to practice deliberate self-doubt before a decision is finalized or a belief is fully committed to. This is the pre-mortem strategy where one asks, let's assume this belief or plan fails spectacularly. What are the 3 reasons we were wrong? This exercise introduces self-dissonance on your own terms, allowing you to strengthen the belief or adjust it before a real-world trigger forces the issue. The scale of certainty. Instead of classifying beliefs as simply true or false, practice rating them on a 1 to 10 scale of certainty. This small mental exercise forces a pause, acknowledging that few things are a 10, thus automatically reserving space for new evidence and reducing the ego's investment in absolute certainty. 3. Empathy and perspective-taking theory of mind. Tribalism thrives on the conviction that the outgroup is not just factually wrong but morally or intellectually deficient. Intellectual humility demands the practice of empathy and perspective-taking. This is achieved by applying the psychological concept of theory of mind, the ability to attribute mental states, beliefs, intentions, desires to oneself and others, and to understand that others' mental states may differ from one's own, understanding the why when encountering an opposing view. The humility practitioner focuses not on the content of the belief, but on the path the person took to arrive at it. They ask, given their starting assumptions, their social tribe, their personal history, and their fears, how does this belief make perfect, rational sense to them? Decoupling content from person. This process forces a decoupling of the belief which may be factually wrong from the person who is attempting to act logically based on their inputs. This reduces the impulse toward out-group derogation, transforming conflict from a moral battle into a joint problem-solving exercise. 4. The role of language. Shifting from absolute to probabilistic language we use reinforces or dismantles our fixed worldviews. The intellectually humble individual adopts a probabilistic language, while the tribal mind relies on absolute language. Absolute tribal language, probabilist or humble language, Psychological effect. This is a fact based on the current evidence. This is the most probable conclusion. Reserves space for revision. Minimizes ego commitment. You are wrong. I interpret the data differently for these reasons. Focuses on data and process, not personal failure. Everyone knows. My social circle agrees with. Acknowledges the tribal context. Reduces projection of group views onto universal truth. Export 2 sheets. Be consistently employing probabilistic language. The individual trains their own cognitive system to accept a level of ambiguity and impermanence in their beliefs. This is the continuous, low-level mental conditioning required to make the painful act of change a rare, rather than necessary intervention. This section provides the internal mechanism for self-correction. The next and final action-oriented section will detail the frameworks for applying this humility in real-world discussions. Section 7. Practical Frameworks for Mind. Intellectual humility provides the mindset and navigating dissonance provides the courage. But to effectively dismantle fixed worldviews and tribal rigidity, we need actionable frameworks, tools for initiating the cognitive crack in a non-threatening, productive manner. The goal is to facilitate mode to dissonance reduction, changing the belief without triggering mode. 3. Self-justification. 1. Street epistemology, the Socratic method in practice. Most effective method for challenging fixed tribal worldviews is not direct confrontation, but gentle, persistent Socratic questioning. Street epistemology SE is a modern framework for applying this principle, using structured conversation to help a person examine the reliability of the method they use to arrive at a deeply held belief. The core principle is non-aggression. The practitioner focuses on the methodology, not the content, of the belief. Is E-step question to ask. Focus. Psychological effect. Dissonance management. 1. Clarification. What exactly do you mean by belief X? Forces the person to define vague tribal cognitions, making the belief concrete and measurable. 2. Reliability check. How confident are you in this belief on a scale of 1 to 10? Introduces the scale of certainty, section 6. Opening the door for doubt and reducing the initial ego investment. 3. Method assessment. What is the best way that a person can verify that this belief is true? This is the cognitive wedge. It shifts the discussion away from what they believe to how they know, often revealing poor methodology, for example, tradition, anecdote. Tribal consensus. 4. Consistency test. Would you use the same method from step 3 to determine if a completely different claim, for example, scientific, historical, is true? Creates immediate cognitive dissonance by showing the person they employ a double standard, method A for tribal beliefs, method B for everything else. This forces a conscious awareness of their own rationalizations. Export to sheets B. Maintaining a neutral, curious stance. C. Allows the individual to discover the flaws in their own methodology, reducing the feeling that the error is being imposed by an external enemy. The self-correction mode 2 is triggered internally, making it stick. 2. Motivational interviewing. MI Principles. Motivational interviewing is a goal-oriented, client-centered counseling approach initially designed to help people overcome ambivalence about changing addictive behaviors. Its principles are profoundly effective in overcoming ambivalence about changing intellectual behavior, fixed beliefs. MI techniques focus on eliciting change talk from within the individual. Rather than imposing external pressure, express empathy. Acknowledge the emotional investment in the current belief. It sounds like this belief is really important to your sense of community. This disarms the tribal defense. Develop discrepancy. Help the person articulate the conflict between their current belief or behavior and their deeper, more universal goals, for example, being a truthful, rational parent or a successful entrepreneur. Example, if your main goal is to grow your business elemental soul, and you hold this highly fixed, unsubstantiated belief, how might that fixed view prevent you from adapting to market changes? This creates dissonance between a central value, success, and a fixed cognition, the belief. Roll with resistance. Do not argue directly. When resistance to the dissonant information occurs, the backfire effect. Acknowledge the difficulty of the change. That's a difficult idea to accept, especially given how long you've held the other view. This respects the emotional toll of change. Section 4. MI works by recognizing that the individual already possesses the motivation for change, the desire to be rational, truthful, etc. And the facilitator's role is simply to help them uncover that intrinsic motivation. 3. The decisional reversal and the devil's advocate mandate for the self-correction process. The ultimate practical tool is the institutionalization of doubt. This requires building mechanisms into one's life that mandate the deliberate creation of the dissonant state. Step 1 in the conversion process, the decisional reversal mandate. Before making any high-stakes decision, one must spend a defined period, for example, 24 hours actively arguing the opposite position. Write a memo detailing why the current path is wrong and why the least popular alternative is the correct one. This consciously triggers cognitive dissonance with the goal of forcing a review of the initial, possibly tribally influenced, position, the devil's advocate group, in a business or community setting. Assign a formal rotating role to a group member, the official dissenter. Their mandated role is to challenge the group consensus and introduce the most compelling, well-researched argument from the opposing worldview. This prevents the formation of a rigid groupthink that fuels the tribal fortress. Section 3, and ensures that the tribe's cognitions are continuously tested against external realities. By making the act of being wrong a protected, ritualized, and respected part of the process, we remove the ego threat and the social punishment, making intellectual humility the default mode of operation. This proactive management of dissonance is the final architecture required to transcend fixed worldviews and fully embrace the evolutionary imperative of the flexible mind. Conclusion: the evolutionary imperative began this exploration by observing the crisis of certainty, a polarized world where the inherent human need for coherence, when warped by tribalism, transforms into a crippling rigidity. We have now dissected the psychological architecture of this crisis and, more importantly, constructed the blueprint for overcoming it. The journey of intellectual growth is not one of seamless enlightenment. It is one of continuous self-imposed cognitive dissonance. The fixed worldview is the mind's natural state, a cozy, low-energy habitat of absolute certainty. The flexible, humble mind is an engineered state, one that requires conscious, ongoing maintenance and a heroic willingness to embrace discomfort. The dissonance recapitulated. From pain to power, the entire framework can be summarized as the transformation of pain into power. The diagnosis sections 1-4, we saw how cognitive dissonance theory CDT creates the aversive tension, and how the mind's self-defense protocols confirmation bias. Backfire effect swiftly reduced this tension through self-justification. We then saw how tribalism amplifies the social cost of admitting error, leveraging the fear of ostracism to cement group beliefs. Finally, the emotional toll shame sunk cost fallacy provides the internal justification for denial. All of this confirms that the fixed mind is a system of maximum ego protection and minimum truth seeking. The conversion sections 5-7, we then detailed the process of conversion, which mandates that the individual sustain the dissonance suspension long enough to achieve a higher consonance, one that honors the core values of truth and rationality. Above the temporary comfort of the fixed belief, we provided the tools intellectual humility, metacognition of doubt, and practical framework street epistemology. Motivational interviewing to make this demanding process scalable and sustainable. The personal and societal benefits of flexibility. Commitment to intellectual humility is not an academic luxury. It is an evolutionary imperative for both the individual and society. For the individual, the flexible mind is the adaptable mind. For an entrepreneur, whether managing the supply chain for Elemental Soul or strategizing the launch of Vile Ivode, the ability to rapidly change a core assumption based on new data is the defining competitive advantage. The intellectually humble person is not paralyzed by past failures. They view every error as a successful data collection event, fueling faster, more precise future decisions. They are less stressed by chaos because they have internalized the truth that uncertainty is the only certainty for society. Tribalism paralyzes collective action by turning every disagreement into an existential war. The continuous application of humility through frameworks that respect the individual while challenging the method of their belief is the only way to re-establish a shared reality. By agreeing on the process of verification, the scientific method, critical thinking rather than demanding agreement on the content of belief, societies can move past gridlock. Intellectual flexibility is the foundation of robust democracy, effective science, and peaceful coexistence. Final thesis restated, the courage to be wrong. The ability to change one's mind is often mistakenly attributed to mere intelligence. It is not. It is a profound, active demonstration of psychological courage. It is the willingness to endure the painful reality that our self-narrative, our social belonging, and our perception of competence are all momentarily threatened. For the sake of arriving at a more truthful, adaptive model of the world, the highest form of human intelligence is not knowing all the answers. It is knowing that all current answers are provisional. The truly successful, truly mature mind is not one that eliminates conflicts, but one that leverages them. Embrace the discomfort. Seek the friction. Cognitive dissonance is not a sign of failure. It is the alarm bell signaling the exact moment you have the opportunity to grow. The price of wisdom is the consistent willingness to feel wrong. The reward is a life lived free from the narrow, debilitating confines of the fixed worldview. A fixed mind seeks comfort. An evolving mind seeks truth. Choose the latter and embrace the architecture of intellectual humility.